Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daria Porter, and I'm a PhD candidate in neuroscience here at Northwestern University. And today, I'm going to tell you about how your nose knows fear. So humans and animals rely on both their senses and their experiences to guide their future behaviors and decisions. And while this is a lot easier to do when we encounter stimuli that we're familiar with, those that we already have representations for, we often encounter new stimuli. So how do we use information about related stimuli to guide adaptive behaviors like finding foods and avoiding danger? Well, let's use apples as an example. Imagine that you've never had an apple before, and I give you this yellow one. When you eat it, you realize it's sweet, so you have a positive experience and a positive association. Now, when you encounter all these other apples, you generalize that positive association and choose apples that are most similar to the one that you already know about. And in this way, stimulus generalization keeps our cognitive load of the brain low so that we don't have to have a separate representation for every apple that we encounter. And stimulus generalization allows us to use previous experiences to make predictions about the future. But say that you then have this sour apple, and it's unpleasant. You now would have two associations, a positive and a negative, and your brain can maintain and use both of them. And in this case, your maximal responding, or the apple that you most often choose, would actually be shifted farther away from the sour apple, as it's aversive, so you want to avoid it. And it's believed that this peak shift is a widening of the distance between the positive and the negative, to try to avoid the negative the most that you can. So here you would actually be choosing apples that are more sweet than the one that you originally had. And this has been shown in various animal studies. But while the physical characteristics of these apples are pretty concrete, the stimuli that our sense of smells deals with are much more ambiguous. And stimulus generalization is a critical ability of the olfactory system. And none of these studies have explored the human olfactory system and how it generalizes. So my research aims to fill that gap. I want to know how we as humans generalize within our sense of smell. And I'm doing so by using isoamyl acetate, which just smells like banana, and beta-pinene, which is a fancy word for an odor that smells like pine. And I'm pairing these with aversive outcomes to study generalization in the human brain. So the first thing that we did when healthy human subjects came into our lab is create 11 equally spaced odor mixtures, ranging from pure pine to pure banana. We then created 2 additional mixtures to serve as our conditioned stimuli. Afterwards, our subjects underwent a fear conditioning, or a learning task, where we paired one of the conditioned stimuli with a shock and the other with no shock. So our subjects were cued with a countdown to sniff. And upon the sniff cue, they received one of the odors, and were also asked to answer the question, is this odor associated with shock? Following the question and odor, if it was a mixture paired with shock, a shock would follow. And don't worry, no human subjects were harmed in the making of this research. The shocks were just highly annoying and never painful. Subjects came back the next day and underwent a shorter version of this learning task. They were then presented with the 11 other odor mixtures, and again cued to sniff and asked, is this odor associated with shock? First things first, I want to show you that our subjects were able to learn significantly above chance to pair the specific mixture with shock. In addition to looking at behavioral metrics of learning, we looked at implicit metrics of learning. And the first one that we looked at was the skin conductance response, which is a measure of the sympathetic nervous system arousal. And the sympathetic nervous system is the one that responds to stressful or fearful stimuli and is often implicated in the fight or flight response. And we found that the mixture paired with shock elicited a much greater skin conductance response than the mixture not paired with shock, indicating a fear response. We then looked at sniff volume, which is an indication of pleasantness and approach towards an odor. And previous studies have found that odors that are unpleasant, like fishy or sweaty, and those that are paired with a negative outcome have a decreased sniff volume. And our findings were just in line with that. The odor paired with shock had a much lower sniff volume. indicating an aversion to the odor. So taken together, these data point toward the fear response tied to the odor paired with shock. So we then wanted to see whether our subjects generalized that fear response. And as I mentioned, our subjects were asked the question, is this odor paired with shock? And after 2 consecutive days of pairing one specific odor with shock, the subjects responded most maximally to a new odor that they'd never encountered before. And their maximal response was shifted away from that shocked odor, similar to the apple example. So this was an indication of olfactory fear generalization. Interestingly, we see a similar phenomenon when we look at the sniff volume, where the smallest sniff volumes are again shifted away from that shocked mixture. We then took our analysis a step further and looked at our at our brain imaging data. And we found that the orbital frontal cortex, or the OFC, is the region of the brain that's tracking this generalization behavior. Now, the orbital frontal cortex is a region that receives information directly from the primary olfactory areas and has a role in pairing odor information with odor outcome. So to summarize, after completing a fear conditioning task where we paired a mixture with shock and another with no shock, subjects generalized this fear response to novel odor mixtures. We then identified the orbital frontal cortex as the region that's tracking this generalization behavior. And the OFC is a region that's tied to emotion regulation and to decision making. And any breakdown in generalization can lead to overgeneralization, which may result in anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. And PTSD has been associated with odor-cued fear and anxiety triggers. So by figuring out how our sense of smell generalizes previously learned odor outcome relationships to new odors, we can figure out how this goes wrong in a disease state. And then we can use that information to help guide better treatments and diagnostic tools for the future. Thank you.